serve it anywhere from sidewalk stalls to very upscale restaurants. And it is a duck egg that has been hard-boiled, fertilized, and incubated. So, and traditionally, the embryo is cooked and is consumed straight from typically duck eggs, although there could be chicken eggs, but mostly duck eggs. So I know you want to see some balut. So if you've got a squeamish stomach, you might want to close your eyes for a minute or two here. So with that, if you could, Johnny, show our little balut video.
Greetings, my beautiful lovelies. It's Emmy. How are you? It's great to see you, and welcome back. Today, I'm going to be showing you how to cook, prepare, and eat balut. Do you know what balut is? Balut is a developing embryo, usually a duck, inside of an egg. It is cooked, it is eaten, and it is well loved. You can find it all over Southeast Asia, including Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and southern China, but is very popular in the Philippines. Now, I had my first taste of balut years ago. My dear friend Ken showed me how to eat it. It was the first time I had it. I enjoyed it, but I have never cooked it myself. So I went to the Chinese market the other day, and there they were for sale. I've never cooked them myself, so today I'm going to show you how to prepare them and to eat them. Balut are nutritious, tasty, portable, and they've been eaten for centuries. So I purchased 2 eggs. They were 99 cents each, and I put them in some boiling water and cooked them for 25 minutes. Balut is often served with a bit of salt or some seasoned vinegar. I've got some palm vinegar here that also has some garlic and some chilies in it. Yum, yum, yum. So we're gonna try it both ways. And you know they're duck eggs because they are much larger than a chicken egg. So you can see the difference in size between the 2 eggs. Duck, chicken. But I've heard that balut also can be made with chicken eggs as well, but ducks are traditional. So there's an air space either on the top or the bottom of the egg. I'm just gonna try the top. I think it's on the other side. So yes, do you hear that sharp crack? That means there's the air space below, like that. And you don't wanna make the opening too large because there's soup in there, and that's what we're going to sip out. A little bit of membrane, and you can take a little bit of salt and drink that soup up. Here we go. Itadakimasu. Tastes like chicken soup. Chicken broth that's slightly eggy, but that little bit of salt, delicious. Now we're going to continue peeling back the shell. And you can see some of the egg yolk in there. Now the egg yolk is what the embryo feeds on while it's developing. A bit graphic, I know, but it's food. And so many people love this, and it is a tradition and one that a lot of people take pride in. The shell is much harder than a chicken egg, it's thicker. And there's the balut. I'm gonna have my first bite with a bit of salt. Itadakimasu. It's eggy, it tastes a bit of chicken, but it's tender, really full, sort of chickeny protein flavor to it, and very, very soft texture. It's delicious. And that was just with a little bit of salt. Now let's try it with a bit of chili and palm vinegar, just right on top. I really like it with the vinegar. The vinegar adds some acidity, some added complexity. It cuts some of the richness of the egg yolk, and that chili in there, a little bit of heat, so good. Now, we're coming to the bottom of the balut. This is pretty much it. And this portion, which is very hard, it's so hard and rubbery and bouncy. Oftentimes this is discarded because it's so hard. It's completely edible, but it doesn't have too much flavor, and it's very, very firm, almost like a rubber ball. So there you have it. That's how you cook, prepare, and eat balut, a very simple, easy, nutritious, and much loved street food from the Philippines. If you ever have an opportunity to try it, I would highly recommend it just to have the experience of.
So I know you're all appetized now for lunch, right? So after seeing that delicious looking balut. Mark, have you ever had balut?
I was gonna say, there is a disclaimer to that. Most Americans that eat that, they do consume it with alcohol.
For good reason.
So I had to quit drinking before I got to that point, so no, I have not tried that.
So you say, well, why in the world would he show this video on balut? Right, so Debbie's saying, yeah, why in the world did you show that? So you'll see in our lesson verses today, one of the main themes is it's not what goes in us that defiles us. It's not the balut that goes in us that defiles us. It's what comes out of us. So, Debbie, does that make sense? Oh, good. I've got a lot of Debbie, so. Yeah. So, yeah. So with that, you'll notice on your handout today that we're using the King James Version. That's not necessarily in honor of Jill, and Jill is sick, by the way, so keep her in your prayers.
Nona is too.
What?
Nona is too. Is sick, and so is Jan Coffey.
I can't. You should cut the microphone.
Jan is sick, and so is Nona. All three are sick.
Okay, so Jan, notice evidently something went through the choir. So Stan's sick, Pastor's sick, so Pastor's supposed to be here. He says this is, the doctor says it's allergies. So keep him in your prayers for the service today. So again, I'm using the King James Version today primarily because I just think it's a more descriptive, I guess you could say, translation of the verses that we're going to be studying, as I said, this week and next week. And I'm just sorry, Jill, well, she may be back next week and she can enjoy the King James Version. Let's hope. So let's figuratively dig in, pun intended, right? So, okay. With that, though, before we dig in, let's open with prayer. And somebody, if you would, volunteer this morning to pray to open us up, I would appreciate it. Mark, thank you.
Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for this morning. Thank you for the beautiful day you've given us. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to gather together and study your word. Let us use it to improve ourselves, improve others. And thank you for the blessings we'll get through it. Thank you for Brother Tom teaching. Guide and direct us in all we do. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mark. Mark, if you would, use your handout and read Mark chapter 7, the first 9 verses, since that is King James Version on your handout.
Then came together unto him the Pharisees and certain of the scribes which came from Jerusalem. And when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is to say, with unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands off, eat not, holding the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the market, except they wash, they eat not. And many other things there be which they have received to hold, as the washing of cups and pots, brazen vessels of tables. And then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, Why walk not thy disciples according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashen hands? And he answered and said to them, Well hath Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, ye hold the tradition of men, as the washing of pots and cups, and many other such like things ye do. And he said to them, Full well ye reject the commandment of God, that ye may keep your own tradition.
Thanks, Mark. So in these first 9 verses of Mark chapter 7, we see a conflict occurring, and is it between whom or between who? One of the English. Who? Whom? Between whom did the conflict occur? Who
The disciples.
the disciples, and so indirectly it was Jesus. That's who they were really trying to get at. But they put this forth as it's really between his disciples and the scribes and the Pharisees. So do you know where these scribes and Pharisees are from? Jerusalem. So if you recall, Jesus is in Galilee. He's in kind of northern Israel. Jerusalem's kind of middle Israel as such. So these scribes and Pharisees have made the trip north in order to try to entrap Jesus through his disciples, through this conflict that they're going to be asking this question about. So with that, let's review a little bit. If you were listening at last Sunday's sermon, Stan talked some about who the Pharisees were, and we didn't mention, I don't think, the scribes, particularly the Pharisees. So who were the Pharisees? What can you tell me about them?
They were a sect of the Jewish people who,
They were a sect. Jamie says they were a sect of the Jewish people. I think Stan said there were at least 7 or 9 sects of the Jewish people. So there were different sects, but this is the most well-known sect. And the word Pharisee means separated one. Separated one. So initially, the Pharisees tried to separate themselves from anything unholy. So over time, this led to the development of numerous onerous rules and regulations that the people were supposed to follow. And this term in verse 3 of what Martha read there in chapter 7 of Mark is the tradition of the elders. That's all these rules and regulations. If I remember correctly, there were 600 plus rules and regulations that they have come up with that were extra biblical. All right, so who were the scribes?
men who studied the law.
They were men who studied the law. They not only studied the law, they also were responsible for copying down the scriptures and reproducing them. So it's a very exacting type of work so that they wouldn't make mistakes in the scriptures. They were official scholars as such because they'd written down and copied the scriptures. They were official scholars of the written law, but also of the oral law, these rules and regulations. And they were the instructors, as Jamie said, and interpreters of the law. So Mark chapter 1, verse 22 says, Jesus taught as one having authority, not as the scribes. So Jesus here in that verse, the people recognized that he was bringing a different message. Or if you remember, Jesus came to fulfill the law and not to condemn the law. So here he was fulfilling the law, and we're going to see what that means as we get further into these verses. In New Testament times, the scribes were viewed by us, looking back on them, as negatively, because they're always kind of lumped in with the Pharisees, and we kind of view the Pharisees negatively, so the scribes are always kind of included with them, so we view them negatively. But originally, the scribes were very important people. Ezra was a godly scribe. It says he was a skilled scribe in the law of Moses. So the scribes became to be known as followers of the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. And we see the same thing with the Pharisees. And most of the scribes were Pharisees also, were a member of that sect. Okay, so why did these Pharisees and scribes come from Jerusalem to Galilee? We kind of mentioned this earlier. What were they wanting to do? They wanted to trick Jesus. They wanted to confront him. They wanted, we might say today, they wanted to pick a fight with Jesus. And what was the reason? What was their reasoning? Why? What was their issue that they were going to try to pick this fight, confront Jesus, trick Jesus with? What was the issue at hand? Unwashed hands. Jesus' disciples were not washing their hands. So the conflict on the surface was between Jesus and these scribes and Jesus' disciples and these scribes and Pharisees over ceremonial hand washing. So why do you think that the scribes and Pharisees from Jerusalem picked this time, this particular time, to come to Galilee to confront Jesus through his disciples? Why now? What had been going on? What had Jesus been doing?
The miracles.
I'm sorry, you got the microphone.
The miracles.
He'd been doing miracles. What miracles had he done recently? He brought people back to life. Yeah.
He
Fed the 5,000 men, so thousands of people. He fed thousands of people. What else had he done? He healed a lot of people miraculously. So Jesus was the kind of the height of his ministry in terms of the miracles that he was performing. So he had the maximum maybe popularity of his ministry at this time. So the Pharisees and the scribes saw Jesus as a threat to their authority, to their power, not only to their authority and power, but also to their financial well-being. If you remember, the scribes and Pharisees, through the sacrificial offerings, a lot of them would take advantage of the common people, be making money off of them. They were either overcharged for the animals they would sell for sacrifice, or they would say, this animal's not good enough, I can sell you, it's not a perfect animal, I'll sell you this perfect lamb. They'd take in the lamb that was, quote, not perfect, supposedly, and then to the next person that came along, they would resell that lamb, or whatever the animal was, to the next person, so they would make double money on it. So they were seeing Jesus through his popularity. You remember Jesus overturned the tables in the temple, the money changers and so forth. So they were concerned about his popularity, that his ministry, that he was leading up to be an earthly ruler instead of a spiritual ruler. And if he became an earthly ruler, then their positions, their power, their financial well-being could be in jeopardy. So we said this, the specific confrontation here, issue here, was over hand washing. So the Mosaic law required ceremonial hand washing by priests, but it did not require others to go through this ceremonial hand washing procedure as such. So these Pharisees and scribes accused Jesus' disciples of not following their law, not following their rules and regulations, the law of ceremonial hand washing. And by implication then, they were accusing Jesus as well as not following the law, not following their ceremonial rules and regulations. So, true or false, the Pharisees and scribes were concerned about the personal hygiene of Jesus' disciples. We got some heads shaking. No. Yeah. Go ahead, Mark, you said. No, they weren't concerned about that. And if you remember last week, Stan spoke that really the the concept, the knowledge of germs didn't come about until the time of the Civil War, 1861. And for some of you scientists and so forth, do you remember who came up with the concept of germs? Has nothing to do with this lesson other than just trivia. So if you're ever on Jeopardy, it was Louis Pasteur in 1861. So did Easton have that? Did he say that? Ah, good Easton. Wow. Very impressed. All right, so let's take a minute. We think of, when you think of ceremonial hand washing, you think, well, they just got a bowl of water and washed their hands and, that's it. 2 minutes, or not 2 minutes, 20 seconds and they're through. That is not what the scribes and Pharisees were talking about. And even today, Orthodox Jews are still following this ceremonial hand washing. So with that, Johnny, let's take a look about what the process of ceremonial hand washing really looked like.
For our discussion of how to wash our hands for bread. If a person's going to be having bread, then they need to wash their hands. Now, if they're having less than a egg's worth, in other words, if you're having less than, let's say, 2 pieces of bread, you should probably wash without a bracha. If you're having, if you're going to wash, and you're going to make a bracha, then you should have a significant amount of bread, as in egg's worth of bread. If your ring has a stone in it, then you definitely need to remove it. Now, as we demonstrate, I will be talking. Of course, usually you don't talk when you wash your hands. It's particularly important not to talk from the time you begin the washing until the blessing is made. Never do we interrupt between a mitzvah and its blessing. Let's say you blow the shofar, and then you make a bracha before the blowing of the shofar. You never interrupt in between those two things. Afterwards, it's also important not to interrupt between the washing and the eating bread. But that's actually less significant. The main thing is not to interrupt between the washing and the making of the blessing. Should you interrupt at that point, that could be a serious problem. If by mistake you talk after you wash your hands, as long as you haven't totally removed your mind from the idea of washing and remaining pure, then you do not need to recite the blessing again. So if we want to pour the water on our hands, we want it to cover all the way from our wrist, all the way to the very ends of the fingertips. In order to do that, we're going to need a significant amount of water. So it's good to fill up a nice big cup. If you use a small cup, this is going to be very difficult to do. If you're in a shortage of water, you could follow a more lenient position of covering just simply up to the knuckles. So we do it as follows. You hold the hand this way so that everything is exposed. Your hand is totally exposed to the water. And you pour it twice. Hand is completely covered with water. Then we would take the towel, hold our hands up, and say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech olam asher kirishanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilat yadayim. And then we dry the hands. You do not make a blessing while you're drying your hands. That wouldn't be proper. You should focus on the blessing. You shouldn't make a blessing after you dry your hands, because then it's completely over. Rather, you should make the blessing before you dry your hands. You also try to hold the hands up so that if there is any water, it falls down on your wrist and not the other way around. The water from above your wrist is impure, and you wouldn't want it to fall below the wrist and then to fall on top of the wrist. That would be improper. So we want to keep the hands up when we're drying our hands. You dry them, you remain silent, and then you've accomplished the washing of the hands. This idea that we have an opportunity before we eat bread of washing our hands is really something that in ancient times, this was only for the Kohanim. Those who ate truma, those who ate the holy foods, the gifts that were given to the Kohanim, they had an opportunity to live at this high level of trying to maintain not only pure body, but pure hands as well. And we nowadays have an opportunity every day, every time you wash your hands, to be able to fulfill this concept of living in holiness. Kedoshim to you, to try to be holy. Every person has a chance to be a little bit like a Kohen. So we wash our hands ritually before the bread. But ultimately, it's not just the hands we want to be ritually pure and clean, but ultimately, it's the ki chavayim uvar levav. We want to have a pure heart as well. Thank you for joining us here at the Anshe Sfard Beth Elameth Congregation here in Memphis, Tennessee. Join us for further discussions of practical halakha. Thank you, Jason Lefkowitz, for making this presentation possible. Thank you.
All right, Mark, can you repeat that Jewish blessing for us, please?
2 cups of water.
So the Pharisees and scribes, as we just said a minute ago, that they required ceremonial hand washing for every Jew, whereas the Old Testament, the actual Old Testament law, only required that for priests. So here the Pharisees and scribes had expanded as such this required ceremonial hand washing not only before the meal, as was kind of referenced there in that video, but they had taken as far as between every course of the meal that you were supposed to go through, according to the Pharisees and scribes, go through this ceremonial hand washing routine as such. So, and then if you had been to the market to buy supper as such, well, you not only had to do the ceremonial hand washing, you had to take a ceremonial bath as well. So you had to wash everything. So again, it was a very tedious process that you had to follow, as you just saw. Very specific rules as how to do that. So what did Jesus then call the Pharisees and scribes in Mark chapter 7, verse 6? And why did he call them this? What did he say? They were hypocrites. He called them hypocrites. He called them pretenders. They talked a good game as such, but they did not live a good game. And that ceremonial hand washing that we just saw, if you saw the guy talking there, he was saying that this was supposed to be representative of a holy life, the hand washing. But here the scribes and Pharisees, they were all about appearances. They were all about outward behavior and indicating that it could be a symptom of a person's spiritual condition, but that may also be misleading. They were just hypocrites. They were misleading folks because their lives were not synonymous as such with the hand washing that they were requiring. So they were supposedly, at this day and time in society, the scribes and Pharisees were the model of good religious folks. So people looked up to the scribes and Pharisees as these ultra-religious people. So they were kind of on a pedestal as such within that society. So here Jesus comes along and says, you got it all wrong. They are hypocrites, they're pretenders, they're all hat and no cap, basically is what he's saying. So this, with the people, would have been quite shocking to them to hear Jesus tell the Pharisees that they were hypocrites. Okay, so do you think the conflict here is really about hand washing, or what's it really about? What's the basis of this conflict? Look at verse 3. What's it say?
Tradition.
It's about the tradition, specifically at that time, the tradition of the elders, or it's about external religion versus real religion. And Isaiah chapter 29, verses 13 and 14 speak to this. So Martha, if you would read those verses, those are the verses that Jesus is referring to in the verses in Mark today.
Then the Lord said, because this people draw near with their words and honor me with their lip service, But they remove their hearts far from me, and their reverence for me consists of tradition learned by rote. Therefore, behold, I will once again deal marvelously with the people, wondrously marvelous, and the wisdom of their wise men will perish, and the discernment of their discerning men will be concealed.
All right, thank you. These verses in Isaiah are a prophecy about Jesus, about the coming Messiah, and it's about true religion versus hypocritical religion, or this religion that the Pharisees and scribes are putting forth. That real religion is from the heart and not all this outward laws and traditions that the scribes and Pharisees were promoting. So the Pharisees, in order to help people keep up with all of this, they produced a book called the Talmud, Talmud. And that book contained all the rules and regulations that a person had to follow, with all the instructions of how to do it, basically. So the scribes and Pharisees recognized the Talmud, this book of rules and regulations, as it was on equal plane, it was on par, it was equivalent to the Scriptures, the Holy Scriptures. So they had raised these rules and regulations to the level of the Holy Scriptures, which at that time obviously was the whole Old Testament. So before we're too quick to condemn these scribes and Pharisees for what they were doing, are we ever guilty of tradition being given equivalency to God's Word? No? Never happens? I see some giggles. So maybe that happens. Can you think of an example of when?
What about observance of the Lord's Supper?
I can't hear you back there.
What about observance of the Lord's Supper?
All right. What about the observance of the Lord's Supper, Jeanette? How's it going?
There are some that we do it, when we do it. There are different churches that do it when they do, so.
All right, good example. So that's a great example, Jeanette, because the actual God's Word said, do this in remembrance of me. He didn't say do this in remembrance of me every week or every month or quarterly or whatever. He just said, when you do this in remembrance of me. But and nothing wrong with doing it every week or every month or every quarter or whenever, as long as you're doing it in remembrance of Him. And, I grew up in a church that did it every week. So wasn't anything wrong with that. Sometimes say that, again, you're to do it in remembrance of Him, of Jesus. So maybe every week it sometimes gets to be routine. So maybe that's an issue. But if you do it every quarter, maybe you're not really thinking as much about Jesus and what He did as you should. So who knows what the right time is when you do it in remembrance of Him. And that's the motivation and that's the thought process. So that's a great one. Thank you, Jeanette. Great. That's a tradition, and different churches have different traditions on that. What else? Anybody else have an example?
There are some pastors in some churches that only will read or allow the King James Version of the Bible.
Yeah, you can only use the King James Version because that's what Jesus used, right? So, yeah, so don't tell Jill that that's not what Jesus used. So, but, yeah, I think it was 1600 and something, if I'm remembering that right, when the King James Version was developed. I may be remembering that date wrong, but yeah. So, but that is tradition, and much more so in times past than maybe today. But yes, that was a tradition.
I've spoken at churches where if you use something else, you wouldn't be invited back.
If you use something other than the King James Version, you wouldn't be invited back. Well, we're using a King James Version today, so rarely do we do that, but we are today. What else? Anything else?
There's some churches that if you're not dressed in a suit, a tie, and a dress, you don't belong in church.
Yeah.
There's nowhere in the Bible that says you have to dress up to go to church.
Yeah. Debbie said sometimes in some churches that the standard attire is a suit and tie and a dress. And that again goes back a number of years when everybody wore a suit and a tie and a dress. And I've got a lot of sports coats and suits, and I've got to get them amortized. So I got to wear them out. I wear them, but I'm the rarity. I'm the exception to the rule now. But just because I got them, I got to wear them. So.
Just the times that you meet.
The times that you meet, meaning, go on.
Well, we were in a church one time.
I'm closer to you.
We were in a church one time that they decided to have a church in the middle of the week also for people that worked on Sunday. So that was a little break of tradition, you know.
Yeah. So, yeah, now it's not, that again is not rare today. You see church, I think that one was a Tuesday night. They had as for college kids and people who worked on Sundays, which had a big following. But now you see Saturday night services and other times of the week. So, great. Yes?
Jeanette was talking about the Lord's Supper. I grew up in a missionary Baptist church, and the Lord's Supper was not offered to people who weren't members of that church that were not Baptists. There were people visiting, and they were Methodists or something.
Yeah.
It wasn't open to
Those heathens, right. Sandra is saying that she grew up in what was then called a closed communion church. You had to be a member of that church in order to be allowed to take the Lord's Supper. We're obviously an open communion church. If you're a believer, you're invited to take the Lord's Supper here, regardless if you're a member or not. Another good example.
What about sprinkling and baptism? Immersion,
Jeanette says, what about sprinkling and baptism? That's some denominations and some religions. What's that?
I said, I don't know, I think they used to call it sprinkling or whatever.
Yeah, all into sprinkling, and in that, if in some religions, if you're sprinkled as a baby, then you're good to go as such. So you're saved, I guess you would say. So that's I don't even know how that tradition got started about sprinkling. That's a good one. I'm not sure, but and again, some have used sprinkling as a signification, I guess you would say, if that's a word, of that you're dedicating the baby to Christ, and the parents are committing to be good Christian parents as such, but they're not really indicating that the baby's saved. It's just a dedication type service. So it depends on what church, what religion you're in, is what they're really doing with that. Okay. You know, when I was writing this, it was, believe it or not, it was Christmas last year, and I started thinking about the risk of nominal Christians thinking the tradition of Santa Claus and the commercialization of Christmas, that is a tradition, that's what Christmas is about. Kind of losing the focus as such of the celebration of Jesus' birth around all the commercialization and all the Santa Claus stuff. Nothing wrong with Santa Claus, don't get me wrong, but again, that's not the real purpose or meaning of Christmas. Is not Santa Claus, obviously, you know that. A little bit more seriously, I guess, and I'll probably step on some toes here. Martha, get after me after this is over. But something that I think about is a tradition of coming to the altar to pray. Nothing wrong at all to coming to the altar to pray, but on the other hand, there's nothing magical about coming to the altar to pray. Your prayer is just as good back there in the back as it is at the altar. But some churches, I'm not saying we're one of those, don't get me wrong, we're not, but some churches think that if you come to the altar, that prayer is heard, your prayer, and the pastor makes this point often, that if you're back there somewhere, that your prayer is not heard. But again, he makes the point that prayer back there, prayer up here, both are effective, both are equal, but some churches think, well, you got to come up here for that prayer to really get to God. So we're not one of them, don't get me wrong. So anything else?
Style of music that we use in our churches.
Style of music, yeah.
Do you use instruments or don't?
Oh, yeah, use instruments. You don't hear that much anymore, but been in churches that don't use instruments at all. It's not, Bible says you can't use instruments. I hadn't found that yet, but yeah, so that's their belief. Some churches even believe the drums, you can use a piano but not drums. I can't figure that one out, so that doesn't make much sense. I think some people are going to be surprised they get to heaven and there's a whole bunch of instruments up there playing or something somehow. So yes, but that is tradition in some churches, from no instruments to only the piano to orchestra. So, tradition. Anything, a lot of traditions here. Okay, and Martha, read Mark 7 again, 8 and 9, we've probably forgotten it from earlier.
For laying aside the commandment of God, ye hold the tradition of men as the washing of pots and cups, and many other such like things ye do. And he said to them, full well ye reject the commandment of God, that ye may keep your own tradition.
Yeah, so if you were to paraphrase or translate these in your translation, what's Jesus saying to the Pharisees and scribes in these verses? What's he telling them?
That you've laid aside the commandments of God for your own commandments.
I'm sorry, say it again.
You've laid aside the commandments of God for your own commandments.
You've laid aside the commandments of God for your own commandments, yes. I think here Jesus is really putting a smackdown as such on these Pharisees and scribes. I mean, they were all into this hand washing and washing these pots and pans and how all this was to be done specifically, as you saw in the video, is a very precise process as such. And Jesus is telling them, you guys, you all are just going through the motions. That's what you're doing, but your heart is not in the right place. And on another occasion, Jesus called the Pharisees whitewashed tombs in Matthew chapter 23, verses 27 and 28. In other words, he's telling them, you look good on the outside, but on the inside, you're rotten. And they would have gotten this. I mean, not so much us today because we're not as familiar with their customs as such, what they were their traditions, but they would have fully understand what he was saying. They would fully understand that he was, in our terms today, they were putting a smackdown. Jesus was putting a smackdown on them, basically. So, all right, so why do you think Jesus always exhibited compassion toward the crowds and their lack of understanding? They didn't even the apostles didn't understand everything. We'll see even here the apostles didn't really understand what Jesus was saying. But he always has compassion on the crowds, but he never hesitates to openly rebuke the Pharisees and the scribes who confronted him. Why does he have compassion on the crowds and not on the scribes and Pharisees? What's the difference? Mary, were you going to say something?
Well, I was going to say because their station in life, the scribes and Pharisees were learned men, and the crowds were just, common people.
Mary says the scribes and the Pharisees were learned men, but the crowds were common folks as such. They didn't have the background, the training, the education as such as the scribes and the Pharisees did. I think that's definitely part of it, that they were supposedly, the scribes and Pharisees were supposedly to be the religious leaders, and they were failing in their job as such. Jesus pointed out they were failing in their job, and they were failing in their job because they were basing true religion on what? on their actions. We would call that today their actions. They had a works religion, didn't they?
And
They-
also, didn't the people didn't have availability to the scriptures. They only knew what they learned at the temple, right? Because they didn't really have the written word in their homes. So they had to go to listen to what they were told to do.
Had to go to the synagogue, yeah, in their local community. And you remember Jesus, when he'd come into the synagogue on a couple occasions anyway, they asked him to come up and as such read from the written word and then speak to the written word. So, because again, you had scribes and Pharisees copying these over. They didn't have printing presses and whatever at that point, so there was limited access to the scriptures, to the Old Testament. So yes, they were dependent upon the learned religious leaders, as Barry said, to promote true religion, and they were failing in that. So, but the Jews, every Jew was required to quote, and I think Stan mentioned this last week, quote the Shema twice a day. A good Jew quoted it at least twice a day. So Martha, read the Shema for us, or Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates.
It says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. The Jews were supposed to, they wore a little headband, and they had a little holder thing in there that had this written in that they'd wear on their head. They had it tied on their robes as such. They were supposed to quote this prayer twice a day. Supposed to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength. We hear later in the New Testament, they didn't get it. Here are the Pharisees and the scribes who were supposed to be teaching the folks, were teaching this religion of works. And Jesus says, you've missed the whole point. It's a religion of love, a religion of faith, not of works. So here, the focus of this prayer that they were saying twice a day had just become a ritual. It had become a tradition. They really weren't understanding, they weren't comprehending what they were really praying as such. So not to say this is not, I would say this is a good prayer for us to pray. It would be great if we prayed this twice a day and actually took the message to heart. We were actually teaching this to our children and our grandchildren. It's a great prayer to pray if you understand and follow. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, strength, soul, and Jesus will go on to add a second commandment to that, love your neighbor as yourself, which is Old Testament. So the Pharisees and scribes have forgotten that true religion is based upon love and not on works. All right, Martha, if you would, read Mark chapter 7, verses 10 through 16.
For Moses said, honor thy father and thy mother, and whoso curseth father or mother, let him die the death. But you say, if a man shall say to his father or mother, it is Corban, that is to say, a gift, by whosoever thou mightest be profited by me, he shall be free. And ye suffer him no more to do aught for his father or his mother, making the word of God of none effect through your tradition, which you have delivered, and many such like things do ye. And when he had called all the people unto him, he said to them, hearken unto me every one of you, and understand. There is nothing from without a man that entering into him can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are they that defile the man. If any man have ears to hear, let him hear.
All right. verse 10, Martha just read, it says, Moses said, honor thy father and thy mother, and whoso curseth father or mother, let him die the death. So what is Jesus quoting in this verse? Mark 7:10. The Ten Commandments, exactly. Do you know which commandment? Trivia question. No, I wouldn't either. The fifth commandment. The fifth commandment is what he's quoting, and it's repeated twice. Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, and Exodus chapter 21, verse 17. Said, and that specifically says, for Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and the one who speaks evil of father and mother is certainly to be put to death. Whew, man, be a lot of dead children today, wasn't there? So that was literally taken, wasn't it? Me, probably one of them. I never made it here. So, but Jesus goes on then in verses 11 through 13, and he provides an illustration. Just in case you Pharisees and scribes don't get it, I'm going to give you an illustration of how you're manipulating the law. And what's the illustration that he gives in those verses? Korban. Again, Stan mentioned Korban last week as well. So this word Korban is only mentioned in Mark chapter 7, verse 11 in the King James Bible. So it was a Hebrew term. It was of Hebrew Aramaic origin, and it means an offering or gift consecrated to the funding of the temple, or it was to be devoted to God. So the practice of Korban among the Jews was that a Jew could say, well, you know, this house I've got, I'm going to dedicate it to God or give it to the temple or whatever when I die. So because of that, I can't take care of my parents. So they would say, but during their lifetime, they could use the house, they could do whatever, they could sell the house, they could do whatever they wanted to with it, but they couldn't use it to support or benefit their parents. So it was supposedly for sacred purposes. So, and even it went so far that the religious leaders would deem it a sacrilege if after they had said, this is Korban, they then decided to let their parents, I'm just using the house as an example, use the house. They let them use the house. That was sacrilege. So they were then breaking their rules and traditions. So the people who had the parents would be sacrilegious because they let their parents use the house. So they went that far. So a person could not reclaim anything that they had designated as Korban. It was now supposedly ultimately at some point for temple purposes or for spiritual religious use as such at some point in the future. So here we see Jesus, though, saying, using the comparison, the illustration of Korban as one of these traditions that the the scribes and the Pharisees were now manipulating for their own purposes and benefits as such. Because if it was dedicated to the temple, who got the use of it? Those religious leaders who were in charge of the temple as such. So they were benefiting from it. So, so in effect, this tradition was nullifying the fifth of the 10 Commandments. And so they were not helping their father and the mother. So, so here it says in Easton's Bible, is this your Bible dictionary, Easton? I just noticed that. So in Easton's Bible dictionary, it says, children were obliged to adhere to the law whether they loved their parents or not. However, with the permission of the Pharisees, they could circumvent part of the law by dedicating money meant for the parents to the temple or sacred purposes through Korban. So So Jesus, again, gave this illustration of how God's laws were made of no effect, how they were ought. I like that word, ought. You don't hear ought anymore, do you? People used to count like ought 1 and ought 2 or whatever. I like that. You don't hear that anymore, though. So probably Easton's never heard ought before, so he didn't know what that was. It means zero. So he says it's of no effect. It's zero. And it is overridden. God's laws here are being overridden by your tradition. So Jesus was, again, pointing out the hypocrisy. He's smacking down these Pharisees and scribes of how their focus was not on love, that they were circumventing it for their own selfish reasons and purposes. So here they were giving the weight of rules and regulations that they had come up with, the scribes and Pharisees had come up with over the years. They were giving greater worth to those than to God's actual word. So that was the real problem Jesus was addressing here. So this is the real hypocrisy of what the issue was that Jesus was using this example of Corban about. All right, so we will finish up beginning with this next question next week. So here Jesus has been speaking to specifically these scribes and Pharisees, and from this point on, he turns his attention elsewhere. So look and see where his attention turns, and we'll pick up there next week and finish chapter 7 next week, and we will then go to Genesis, as we said. So thank y'all for being here this morning and your participation. So have a blessed week. Thank you.